no further ado, I'll let the team take off. Everyone, please put your questions in the chat window, and we'll do see what we can do to make sure we get them answered.
So before we go, sorry, go ahead, Mark.
No, that's fine. The recording has started, so go ahead, Manny.
Okay. So before we get started with the questions, so we have Mike Russo's online. So he's written an article about how to programmatically scale a cluster, Service Fabric cluster. So I want to just have him talk for 5-10 minutes on, on what he did and give you a pointer to that article. So Mike?
Yeah. Hi, Mani. Are you guys able to hear me all right?
Yes, we are able to hear you.
Okay, excellent. Let me go ahead and share my desktop. Just I have a couple of slides. They're not important in case anyone can't see them, but, for those who can, I'll go ahead and share that.
Okay.
You guys able to see my screen?
Something's loading.
Okay.
And yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. So I'll go ahead and get started then. Yeah, so what this topic's about basically is I was recently working with the customer who was moving an existing microservice application over to work as a Service Fabric application in Azure. And one of the reasons they wanted to make that move was to benefit from the easy scaling that Service Fabric offers. And so I sat down with them and we walked through a couple different ways that they could scale their application, and it was an interesting enough experience that I put a little blog post together on it. Mani then recommended that rather than make it a blog post, we could just add some conceptual docs, which would stick around for longer and be easier to find, on the topic of scaling programmatically, because some of the other scaling approaches are already well documented. So that's sort of what led to that. So what I thought I could do now for a few minutes is just sort of briefly walk through what that scaling experience was like and how we did it, since it might be interesting to others. And then if you want to know more, you can go check out the document, which I believe is going live later today. And if that doesn't happen, I'm sure we can send out like a preview draft or something. But for those who haven't done a lot of scaling before with Service Fabric, the way it works is that Service Fabric clusters are all built on top of Azure Virtual Machine scale sets. And a scale set is just a pool of identical VMs in Azure that are all created from a single template, which support increasing and decreasing the pool size dynamically. So Service Fabric itself doesn't really have any special scaling features. It just is built on top of the VM scale set concept. So Service Fabric app gets that for free, basically. And when you look at Service Fabric applications, each node type in your Service Fabric app is going to correspond to a scale set. So that means that when you have a scaling operation, it's going to happen for a particular node type. And this was especially interesting in the case I was working on recently, because the customer had these very spiky workloads where they would need a lot of computing power for a day, and then they wouldn't need hardly any for a week. And so what they wanted to be able to do was to have large, beefy VMs in their Service Fabric cluster, which were only available periodically. So they actually ended up with two different node types. They had a worker node type that they could scale all the way down to 1 or 0 VMs when there was very little work. And then they had a primary node type where all of the Service Fabric services like the naming resolution service and various health services ran, which always had a few nodes around. And this way they could scale different types of nodes differently by making them different types. So the first thing we looked at was just sort of the simplest way to scale, which is to work with the VM scale set directly through PowerShell commandlets. I've got in this slide here a few examples, but you can go check out the docs. It's pretty well documented that there's this get Azure RM VMSS commandlet, which will give to you the a VM scale set, and then you can interact with that. And one of the properties on it is .skew.capacity, which will give you the size of the scale set. So if you have 5 instances, it'll say 5. You can then change that and call the update Azure RM VMSS commandlet, passing that updated object back in, and that will resize the scale set. So it's that easy from a command line to change the size of a scale set and therefore a node type in Service Fabric. Now the thing that makes this a little bit more complicated is that scaling out, adding more nodes, works great out of the box. Scaling in requires a couple extra steps because when you scale, you're doing it at the VM scale set level. So Service Fabric doesn't have any knowledge of these changes. So there's a couple extra things we want to do here. You want to use the Service Fabric CLI as well. You want to be able to disable the Service Fabric node that's about to be removed so that it can shut down gracefully and services can be migrated away. And then after you've changed the size of the scale set, you'll probably want to call remove Service Fabric node state, which will, without that, the idea that this node exists will still, Service Fabric will still know about the node, and so when you're looking like in your manager or something, you'll see this node that's down. And so it's helpful to do that just for cleanliness. Wow, we got some music going. All right, so I mean, and there's some links here if you want to learn more, but that's sort of just like the briefest way to do it manually. If you were to then take it one step further, you can use autoscale rules which are built into VM scale sets. And this allows you to set up triggers that in the resource manager template, which will cause the scale set to expand or contract automatically when these triggers are met. And so this is a way that you can do it without having to have someone manually go and increase the number of nodes or decrease them. And so that's kind of a little bit easier. The one issue that you may run into here is that you have to use the triggers which we have available. And there's actually quite a few, and I have this link from here. There's many triggers you can choose from, but it's still a finite list, and so you need to scale based on those kind of metrics, like the size of a service bus queue or processor utilization in the scale set instances or things like that. Also, this isn't going to do any of the Service Fabric cleanup, so you'd be responsible separate from this auto-scaling for removing nodes that have been shut down, things like that. So in the case where I was working with this customer recently, they looked at the auto-scale rules and they considered using them, but there was a couple reasons that it wasn't a perfect fit. The first reason was that they had a complex architecture where they wanted to scale based on the combined number of messages over a distribution of queues. And so that isn't a built-in metric. We can scale based on the number of messages in a single service bus queue or a topic, but we can't scale based on like the total of these 50 different queue lengths added together. The other thing that was a little bit problematic for them was that they wanted this to be entirely automated so that after a scale-in operation happened and instances were removed from their scale set, they wanted the Service Fabric cluster to also update and remove those node states so that they didn't have these kind of ghost nodes hanging around looking like they had nodes that were down, which actually had been removed. So what we did was we used some of our APIs in the Azure Management Compute Library. We have this fairly new Fluent Compute Library API, which can interact with VM scale sets programmatically. And we also use the Service Fabric SDK, the Fabric Client API, for interacting with the Service Fabric cluster. And so this is the piece that I actually added some documentation for, and I've added the link here if folks want to go check it out. Like I said, I expect this to be live later today. If there's any sort of hold-up, we could maybe email a draft of the doc out to the group. But this just sort of goes over
Mike,
the...
Mike, I have a clarification. So just because there are some customers who actually do have durability of gold, so any customer who has like a D15, they don't need to jump through the hoops we just talked about. Like, it's not an 8-step process which you're trying to do. So just want to make sure that customers understood that for a fact. And then when we do release this silver durability, then a lot of what the pain you talked about, like orphan nodes hanging out in the FM state, those things will just go away. The fact that, the fact that you would actually scale in or scale out the VMSS, the rest of the the graceful shutdowns will absolutely happen. So this is actually the interim for customers who are using Bronze at this point, and so it's very relevant to that conversation.
Right. Thank you for clarifying. I completely forgot to mention that, but you're exactly right that, with Gold tier, the cleaning up of the node states does happen. This is Bronze where you need to do this. Thank you. So just sort of to briefly go through sort of the way that you can do this yourself from your own code. is first creating a service principal so that you can authenticate, and there's some links there that you can follow to learn about creating a service principal, so that you don't have to have some sort of interactive login every time you want to interact with your scale set. But then once you've done that, the Azure client, which is part of this new Fluent compute library, allows you to very easily just call its virtual machine scale sets, get by ID API, to get a scale set object in your program. From there, then, you can call .update and give it a new capacity, and this allows you to do the same sort of thing that we were doing from PowerShell manually, automatically. And this could be done from some stateless service running in your Service Fabric application, or it could even be done from outside the application just by some separate management tool. And then scaling in is going to be similar. The difference, of course, is that, again, if you're in bronze tier, then you would need to use Fabric Client API as well to manually remove your node state, deactivate the nodes, remove the state as needed. But again, because this is happening programmatically, you could just make that part of your scale-in operation, and you'll get that happening, along with the scale set changes. So again, there's some links here, particularly if you go out to the documentation. I sort of walk through in a little more detail what a code sample looks like of doing that. But for the customer I was working with, it worked as a nice option for setting up automatic scaling with a very specific set of scaling criteria, where they wanted to scale out if these very particular criteria were met, and scale in some other situations, and they didn't have to just be doing it all manually. There are a couple of caveats I'll point out. The first is that there was a bug in the Fluent SDK which prevented this from working, and that was fixed recently, but we still need to get an updated version of the library shipped. So in the very near term, you may need to use the PowerShell SDK, which you also can do programmatically as a workaround. The issue was just that the Fluent Compute Library, when it added nodes to added instances to a scale set, it was losing protected settings in the ARM template. And that's where we keep things like joining the Service Fabric cluster and things like that, which were very important settings to have. So as a workaround, you can use the PowerShell SDK, and my documentation goes over what that looks like if you need to do this in the very near term. But like I said, we've already got a fix for this bug merged, so it's just a matter of getting a new version of the compute library shipped, or you could go and build it yourself or something and work that way. And then also there's a little bit of logic which I cover in the document just to figure out which nodes will be removed, because you need your Service Fabric API to figure out which nodes to shut down and which nodes to remove, and they need to be the same nodes which are actually going to be shut down when the scale set scales in. And the simplest way to do that is when you're not removing a seed node, which I would imagine you wouldn't typically do, it's just going to be the node with the highest ID. And so I've got a little code in the documentation as well which demonstrates how to find that and make sure that you're disabling the right node. But it's another thing to kind of look out for as you're setting this up, because again, you'll be working with the Service Fabric and scale set APIs independently, and you need to make sure that they match. But that's sort of what I had to cover. Just wanted to point out some of these different ways you have a lot of different options for scaling a Service Fabric application, and point folks at the new docs that will be available shortly. Any questions on any of this?
I think everyone can read your docs, and
there's a whole bunch of questions, but we'll deal with them as we go through the IAM windows, I think.
Oh yeah, I see all those questions coming in. Sorry, I was missing those movement. Yeah, we can deal with them later.
So Mike, the one ask is, can you just upload that presentation so that people can get access to those links?
Yeah, sure. I can do that. What would be the best place for me to put it?
Probably in the Skype session.
In the Skype session.
Oh, yes. Perfect. Yep, that makes sense. I'll do that right now.
All right. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks,
Mike.
Yep,
absolutely.
Thank you. Super.
All right.
And we'll start asking the questions that were in the IAM window. Mark, it looks like the browser and things dropped off. If somebody wants to add those back on.
Just go present screen. Yeah, the top.
Okay.
Present screen at the top. There.
Okay. And then we needed the whiteboard in the browser window back because you wanted to show something, I think.
That's good, I think.
That's good.
You
need to go-
messages on the side there, yes?
Yeah.
So let's start at the top and we'll.
Okay.
Do you want me to scroll up and down here?
Is there a timeline for the Service Fabric backup application that was mentioned in the previous QA session? I believe that that's coming out around the build timeframe at this point, as to when it would actually be released. I don't have any more granular dates around that in particular. Feel free to ping us if you need a more specific date. We can look up exactly how that's coming along.
The preview is coming out in the build time frame. Just the 5-6 days.
Preview is coming along in the build time frame. GA will be a little bit after that, probably in the next release after build. So there was a question that apparently didn't show up. Is any idea when a service bus queue/topic listener will be available for Service Fabric?
We're not building a.
Well, I mean, we wouldn't build one out of the box.
There's an example that shows
probably,
the event hubs, which is similar.
Yeah, there's the Event Hub one, which is pretty similar. There's probably a Service Bus one out there on GitHub somewhere that you can find.
I know that Loc that did do a Service Bus producer-consumer queue
Yeah, that's right.
listener.
Yeah.
That does exist as a GitHub project and as a NuGet package that you can get. I think it might be is that one for actors only? I can't remember.
See if we can find it and post it.
Yeah, we'll find it. We'll see if we can find it and post it in the links. Let me look for that.
With respect to Windows container support, so the 5.5 release will not have a whole bunch of features. It will mostly have fixes and improvements that you will see the improvements in terms of placement as well as in terms of error reporting and those kinds of things. But big features are going to be mostly coming in 5.6, that is at the build timeframe, which will include things like volume mapping, log driver support, those kinds of things. DNS service. So those will be coming in at around the build timeframe. So
if you go look in the containers article, it says a roadmap inside there, and you'll see that will be coming inside the build, which will be the 5.6 release.
Yeah.
Is there any timeline for the target to .NET Standard with SDK?
Yeah, .NET Standard, yes. So we're looking at targeting .NET Standard 2.0, and that itself won't be released until the third quarter of the year, so right around the fall. So we're targeting about the same time frame for the SDK. Yeah, that's about it.
Okay. Okay, what's the best way to support multiple environments within inside a single cluster? For example, several copies of an application for developers, demos, QA, production.
So there's a few different ways you could do this. If it depends a lot on how much those different application instances are going to step on each other's toes. There's really nothing, if they're pretty isolated and good about that, then you can just run them on the same machines. If you do need to separate them, then we've seen people use placement constraints and node types. So you would create a different node type for each environment in the same cluster, and then you would deploy the services from a given application constrained with placement constraints so that they only ran on that one node type. And that way, one workload from, say, your test environment is never running on the same VMs as the production environment.
So I have to caution, I'm the ops guy, so I will just clearly say do not put your production workload on the same cluster as the rest of them.
Yeah, probably not.
You will run into security issues, it's all a disaster waiting to happen. So everything else was fine. Developers, demos, QA, please don't put production workloads in the same cluster as the rest of them.
Yes, keep them separate.
So it's a bad idea.
Okay, can you scale by adding and removing entire scale sets? Yes, you can.
Of course.
Yeah, that's adding node types.
It is
That's
just
a new type, and that's the way of doing it all.
And I think that there's some work going on to make that a little bit more direct and easy.
Yeah, do you want to talk about Silver at all?
so okay, sure. So a couple of things so Matt just prompted me to say that yes, we are actually working on a Service Fabric RM module. Basically, that'll be a new module, a PowerShell module, which will be shipped as a part of Azure SDK. So that actually will simplify things like adding certificates, creating secure clusters, rolling over certs, adding new ports, and those things. So and then there's also a Swagger spec which will ship with it. So then you can actually make sure that you can actually use that to generate other APIs you might need in other languages. So that's coming up. I also, as a part of the build rollouts, is when it comes.
Which is when we say build rollout, we mean the 5.6 release.
So the reason why I don't want to tie to 5.6 specifically is because it's an Azure SDK, so their release rhythms are slightly different. It'll be in the April timeframe that will go.
And when we say build, it's mid-May.
Yes, mid-May. Yes, mid-May.
It's the build conference we're talking about.
Yeah, we're talking about
It's
build
not a build
conference.
output.
Yeah, the build conference.
As soon as the build finishes.
As soon as the build finishes.
Yes,
And
yes.
so,
Compiling for all.
CSC, and then you just wait for a while.
so the second question was Marcine's comment on the auto scaling. Do not do a auto scaling down when it is at bronze, because you might remove your VMs quicker than it should go out. So that actually is a valid concern.
Just
so do it
remember
slowly.
that. Just remember Mike's scenario is that he only scaled the node type that was not the C node, right?
Irrespective, even if
so
it's
you
not,
still might
your
host
app,
yourself.
you can host yourself as well, right? And then once the silver and or durability comes in, a lot of what we just talked about becomes easy because we would be safer. And silver durability is planned. So it's in private preview now. If there is a particular customer who wants to have it, just ping me back. We'll actually onboard you. But otherwise, publicly we'll announce it at build.
Mid-May.
Mid-May, yes.
Build.
Okay, is there a plan to create the same file new experience with Service Fabric and Docker, similar to the new Docker tooling in ASP.NET Core and Visual Studio 2017?
Then you create the same file new experience with SFM.
Yeah. I mean, we should talk about, yes, I mean, the experience you have now inside Visual Studio is that you can Dockerize an existing ASP.NET application, yes?
Yes,
you
you
can
can
this
create
off
new .NET Core applications and Dockerize them. Basically, have Visual Studio help you create Docker files and compose files to go ahead and build your container images. And what you can do today in Service Fabric is then create a Service Fabric service, which is a Gates container, and use that to go ahead and deploy those containers into Service Fabric cluster.
Yeah, and that build we are working on having an integration to Visual Studio done for that as well. So yeah,
Yes, so yes, we're
build as
working.
in build conference.
Build conference.
Yes.
Mid-May. Everything was happening.
Right, is the civil durability tier going to be included in the next release? I think you answered.
Not the next release, it'll be mid-May.
Mid-May, okay. How do we enable operations teams to add additional instances of a service using upgrade option? Currently we get an error saying the default descriptions can't be updated. Example, I have a service in 10 node cluster with 5 instances. Due to load, I wanted to scale the instance count up to 8. How do you do this using upgrades?
Okay,
Yeah.
so you're using default services is probably what I
Yeah,
imagine
so-
that means. Well, so there's a fix to that
Right.
in the next release.
Right. So what's going to happen? There's two things that's going to happen. First of all, we're rolling out a change, a fix, where that type of change to your application type will have the intended effect that will start an upgrade. When that upgrade completes, we will go through and look at the difference between the default service declarations that you have, what are currently running in the cluster, and then what the new definition is. So in your case, you said, yeah, I had this application parameter, I set it to 10, the upgrade rolled through the cluster. Now, what is the behavior that I get out of the end? So what we'll do is we'll call the underlying API on your behalf, which is update Service Fabric service, and we will change that parameter from 5 to 10 as you want it. Now, that's all going through the default services mechanism, and default services as a mechanism has this particular hang-up where you're kind of mixing two things, right? You're mixing the version of your application and the settings for these particular services. And that's part of why generally we kind of say by the time you've made it to production and you want to be scaling dynamically and doing things like that, we kind of recommend that you move away from default services. And then you start to think about dynamic service creation or creating services manually, because it makes this whole thing a lot more clear. You've got your application type definition, which just says, here's my application type and here's the service types inside of it. And then you've got kind of your deployment definition for what's actually running in the cluster. And that's when you said, hey, I'm going to create this service. I want it to have 5 instances. Oh, I want to update this service. I want it to have 10 instances. So separating those out really helps keep these concepts clear and avoids this particular also bug. We're fixing the bug, but it still can be a little bit confusing because now you have questions like, well, what happens if I added a default service to my application type definition? When does it get created? What happens if I remove a service from my application type definition? When does it get deleted? What happens if the application rolls back? All of those things, you can figure them out, and we'll describe them to you, but it's a little bit confusing, and so generally we think that it's good to separate the type information in your application type from the instance information about what is actually running in the cluster.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. So generally, default service is good for getting initial started and debugging.
Yeah, I love them for my F5 experience because then I can actually get a debugger attached.
But
right?
when you start
It's
to
a bit
roll
of a
out,
shortcut.
but when you roll out to production, get rid of them.
Yeah. And you're going to want to do that anyways, because in your production environment, you probably have a CI/CD environment integrated, and that's really where you should be creating those instances of your service.
Let's address this one here. Is there a date for the next SDK for the 5.5 release? And
So at this point, that release is rolling out in production, and we'll release the SDK when that rollout is complete. We can't give you the new SDK before it's available for you to download and use in production, because then things get mismatched. That's it. So I think in probably the next few weeks is when it's going to be finally available. It's rolling out currently.
Yeah, so
there's a bunch of rules that we have to follow when things are rolling out that slows it down a little bit.
So we have around 30 plus 39 regions at this point, and so we rolled out to 7 at this point, and so we'll wait for the rest of them to roll out. Typically, it takes a week because we pause in between to check and health of the region and so forth. So expect it to be in a week's time, unless we hit something.
okay, there's another question here on auto-scaling. How can you auto-scale the number of nodes used per service based on each service's load? It seems that you either need to host on a defined number of nodes, all the nodes in a cluster. I'd like per service auto-scaling rather than cluster auto-scaling, because the scalable services need to be on all the nodes.
Well, there's kind of two ways to think about this. So when you say, per service type, you can use something similar to what Mark showed, right? Which is where you're looking at the information coming out of your service. You could either be reporting load to Service Fabric, so you can say this service is now consuming 10 foo, and then you know that your service should really only be handling about 5 foo on this number of instances, so you can create and delete more instances dynamically. The other thing is that just reporting load in general helps Service Fabric reorganize the existing services in the cluster. So say you have a whole bunch of different types of services and instances of services running in the same set of machines, but you know that one of them gets more heavily loaded, and you want that service to get more resources, right? So reporting load with the Service Fabric Cluster Resource Manager APIs can help you do that. And what will happen is other services will get moved away or moved out of the nodes where that hot service is running, and then that service gets kind of more resources dedicated to it. It's not quite the same as creating more instances on the fly, which again is a dynamic action that you'd have to decide when to create more actual service instances and when not to. That's something we may do in the future for stateless services. For stateful services, it's a little harder. But that's kind of the two ways that we'd recommend doing it, is either think about having a monitor or a watcher that's going to watch your service and know when to create more service instances, new Service Fabric service on the fly, or just rely on the load metrics and the reorganization of the existing services in the cluster to grant that service more resources that it can use.
And by the way, this is another good example of why you should not use default services, because default services kind of ties you to here's my one instance, and what Matt was talking about is creating multiple of those dynamically.
Yeah,
which is a different. When we say instances, this is a different instances than the previous question. There was instance count, which is kind of the stateless corollary to replica count for stateful, but it still belongs to the same service instance. I just say I'm creating a new service and I want 10 copies of it. Yeah. What Matt is saying is I want a whole new instance of that service with its own number of copies.
And its own name.
Yeah, and its own name, exactly.
Okay, Marcin points out the risks of scaling down on the bronze tier, which we talked about. He also has a question. I've reported some issues with WebSockets on GitHub. Any news on these?
If that's for reverse proxy, then that's something that's being worked on. I'll go look that up on GitHub and see if I can get a response to that.
Maybe post the actual...
if you have a link, maybe post a link.
Post a link inside all of that. Okay, so then there's, can you give examples of large Service Fabric customers and number of nodes clusters they are using? Well, I can't speak too much about some of our external customers. Internally, I mean, for example, we can talk about Intune.
Yeah.
Intune runs, they're sort of a medium size for us. They have about 25 Actually, they have a per region cluster, and each cluster is around about 40 machines in size. And on each one of those, they run tens of thousands of services. So that's sort of a medium-sized one.
We do have customers in production without naming any names that are in the hundreds of nodes.
Yes, we have some
running thousands of cores.
Yeah, there's some clusters with several hundred nodes in the cluster.
And I think tens of thousands of service instances.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
So they're actually pretty large.
Yeah.
Right. So internally there is the code signing team specifically actually has 1,000 node cluster with 60 node types. So we know that they really are using a lot of compute on that side.
Did you say 16 or 60?
60
node types. That's
Yep.
a lot.
They have all the combinations of virus scanners, environments, and all that
they're
stuff.
code
So
signing, right? So they do
Yep.
all kinds of compliance.
That's good.
Okay, Roberta asks, which is the best approach to create security boundaries between services in order to not let them access the fabric management from inside? Can you suggest a way to implement the sort of ACLs, i.e. service A can access only the application instance, but not other instances, I presume?
Well, I mean, there's no built-in mechanism to that, but there are a couple ways you can do that. One is you set up authentication of your own. And the other is you can run services under different credentials, and so you may be able to use that to your advantage. But other than that, there isn't really anything built in for services. The only security restrictions that we have built in is for accessing the management APIs, and even there you only have 2 levels. You have admin, which can do anything, and then read-only. But for service-to-service access, that's authentication you'd have to set up.
Yeah, service-to-service access we've seen there, it's either you're putting certificates on every service doing authentication, or every service itself authenticates through to AAD, and you have a shared AAD credentials between all, and that's using the AAD client libraries effectively to do all of that.
I'm sorry, I would like to ask one question regarding this.
Yes.
Because as far as I know, replicator service is unsecured by default. Am I right or not?
The replication, yes. If you want to have the replication between the replicas inside your state secure, you can. You just have to provide it a certificate in order to do that.
Yes, but it's just want to make sure it's unsecured by design, by default. Yes.
Correct. Yeah. By default, it's unsecure. So all the traffic, yes. By default, the messages that go between replicas is unsecure. Of course, they're all within inside your cluster, though. So it then depends on the security of accessing your cluster.
Yeah, if the cluster is wholly unsecured, then you absolutely have a problem. If the cluster is secure, then you're only deploying things into that cluster that you trust. And presumably, yes, even though that's true. So say you trust 2 different workloads. If workload 1 wanted to, it could look on the wire and it would see our goofy format for replicating data between 2 replicas, if you did sniff that. Every single replicator, every single service partition can configure its own replicator cert or its own control around that traffic so that can be encrypted, but we don't set that up for you by default.
Yeah.
We're trying to think about whether or not we want to provide a additional certificate in the cluster that would be used to, by default, secure all that replicator traffic. That would still only be 1 cert for the cluster, and again, if you're already in the cluster, you could kind of see that cert, but it would be better than what we have today.
Okay. Can we add an ICS calendar entry for this? Yes, we will do. Manny, can we pop that in the next blog post?
Add the calendar.
Add a calendar.
Sure.
It makes life a lot easier. Okay, how does testing reliable collections work locally? If the stateful service is restricted to 1 replica so as to not fight over ports, what effects are there? I ask because I've read that the minimum replica count for reliable collections is 3.
Well, there's different levels of testing. So if you're just doing unit testing and isolation testing, then the answer is you go and mock out the reliable collections. Since we provide interfaces for everything, you can simply mock those out. Then you're just testing your code. Then the next stage of that is if you want to test against the actual runtime where there's actually replication going on and real asynchronous operations and locks being taken and that sort of thing. The minimum that we say you run with is 3, yes, that's true, but we do operate a 1-node environment where you can run with 1 replica, in which case there isn't any replication happening, but you still have the same locks being taken and the same synchronization happening. The port conflicts shouldn't. I don't know how you're getting port conflicts actually, because you should be assigning dynamic ports for stateful service.
Yeah, most stateful services don't listen on a static port.
Right. You generally don't have static ports there. The replicator endpoints, in particular, should never be using static ports. Those should always get dynamically assigned ports. And then if you have endpoints that you expose in your service, those too should be using dynamic endpoints. So port conflicts usually shouldn't come up on a local box.
And even for a stateful service, most of the time, only the primary would be listening anyway.
That's true. Right.
By the time the first primary shut down, even if you were listening on a static port for one partition, you'd only have the primary listening, and then it would get shut down, and the secondary would get promoted. So even then, you shouldn't be seeing port conflicts, even if you had a static port for a stateful service.
Right.
So that's not much of a problem usually. Yeah.
Okay. I think there was a question around: is there a method for? No, hang on.
How can default services for an application be reinstantiated with those params in case of deletion?
Yes.
Yeah. See, this is goofy. Today, you would have to either do an upgrade that removed the default service from the application manifest, and then another application upgrade which put it back. At which point the default service would get created again.
Or if you're stateful, you've lost all your data.
At this point, there's no bueno.
Yeah.
That's the default services way of getting it back. What I would say is, and you may notice a theme here, probably stop using default services and switch to just creating and deleting the services on the fly. Now, if you delete the service on the fly and the service is still gone and all the same bad things have happened, but getting it back is just a matter of new service fabric service or create service async.
But I think it'll make more sense to you too if you set it up that way. Because then it's very clear.
I called this API.
I called an API and I deleted the service. I called another API and I recreated the service, and we're back.
It's all in one place.
And there's no monkeying around with XML configs and wonky upgrades. I mean, creating a service by doing an application upgrade itself is a pretty strange concept. Generally, that's not the way.
Okay. Roberto asks, we are working on-premise. What do you think about topology with 5 small primary nodes with fabric services and no applications deployed, and other types for the applications? Does it make sense to do on-premise?
Yes. So this question actually is applicable whether it's even in an Azure world. Same conversation, right? So system services are actually like the main organs of your body. So if you try to starve them, you have a problem. So as long as your definition of small doesn't mean that it's partial cores and so forth, you can try them out. That is a fine way to do it. In terms of a pattern, yes, sometimes we do specify, for example, very large clusters, like the 1,000 node clusters we talked about, 300 node clusters we talked about. Anything over 60 some nodes, we've always recommended that we keep the system services, the primary node type as a separate one, so that then you know that they are not getting, they're getting enough resources. So to answer your question, it depends on your application and the usage of your cluster.
It depends on what else is going on in that cluster, how many services there are, how many upgrades are going on, how many health reports there are. If the cluster is overall small, then a bunch of small machines for the system services is fine.
Yes.
But if that, if it's 5 small nodes for the primary node type for the system services, and then you've got 1,000 nodes with 100,000 services, then you might not be giving enough resources to the system services, and you'll start to see degradation because of that.
So, like for example, in initial days, customers used to do A0s for primary and D4s for the secondaries. That is not a great idea.
Yeah, I mean, and generally having system services and your applications together isn't a bad thing. That's okay. You just got to realize that as you start to scale the number of application instances you run, you just have to be careful about the expected load on the system.
Well, like with most things, you're sharing resources, so it's possible that you step on your own toes.
Yes. Okay, so we answered the date for the 5.5 release. Everyone keeps posting and that keeps moving. Where are we?
Question we are working on, this is from Roberto. Is there a sort of tap to work with feedback to the product group on environment test, fine-tuning, and troubleshooting? Who wants to handle that? There's a bunch of different ways to get in touch with us.
That's support. Basically, there's a support article. We can find it for you.
Yeah.
But he was looking for more of a preview or.
Well, the only piece we're sort of doing tap at the moment really is on our Linux preview for a little bit. So if you're interested on the Linux side of things, I mean, the best thing to do is work through. if you have contacts in terms of it's cloud solution architect, they get in contact with us a lot. We, the product team, don't run direct tap programs anymore, apart from for some of the Linux stuff that's still in preview.
Or new features, new things that came out. So we did one when on-prem started a while ago.
Yeah, most of the time work through GX and cloud solution architects if you have some people you work with. Okay.
Are there anything particular you're looking for preview?
Yeah, if there's something
it's more like a general question.
Yeah, tell us what you're looking for, and maybe we can help you. I have extreme elastic scaling requirements from 0 to 1 node in a given node type, up to 100 instances on an intraday basis.
Okay, what should I be aware of? So
what should I be aware of?
I can try to take this.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming you are in Azure. So a couple of things you have to be very certain of. One, adding nodes take time. So there's no instantaneous thing which is going to happen. So plan it out. From 0 to like 100 instances, it's going to take time. I would assume at least like half an hour. And there is no guarantees that actually will show up when you need it. So basically plan for it. That is something you should absolutely be aware of. Once you get the nodes, yes, scale outs typically do not have any issues from a service fabric angle or your application itself, because there isn't anything on them at that point. And then load balancers just move stuff onto them. Scale down, do them slowly till you get the silver or a gold durability. Once the silver or gold durability happens, actually you can certainly move large chunks of VMs down. Like for example, you can go from say 99 nodes to say 85 or 80 or a 60. I will still not do a slide down of going away from 90 nodes all the way to 10, because that just means that many, depending on whether it's stateless or stateful, stateless may still work, but still there's lots of reconnections which you have to think about. Stateful, I would do it a little more slowly, because there are replicas to be moved and recreated. So,
yeah. And the health checks will slow you down anyway. If anything, the VMSS layer does decide to go fast enough.
Yes. So that's the thing you should be worried about.
The other thing I'll say about scaling up and down with that, there's another thing that we've seen people do, and this is a way of kind of avoiding some of that scaling, which is that you try to find workloads that are complementary, so that when workload 1 is heavy, workload 2 is cold, and vice versa, and you run them on the same machines. And that way, so long as you get a reasonable level of workloads on the machine at all times, you don't really need to scale them all the way down to 0. It might not necessarily work in your environment, but it's just something for others to be aware of. Is if you can find those types of complementary workloads that don't step on each other's toes and that are kind of one is warming up while the other one is cooling down, then you might be able to sit at a medium-sized cluster rather than trying to dramatically change the size of the cluster all over the place, right? So if I had 2 workloads, one that scales up at night and one that scales up during the day, I could put those on 2 different node types, and then I could scale first thing in the morning node type 1 all the way up and node type 2 all the way down, and then at night flip them around and scale node type 2 all the way up and node type 1 all the way down. But what I could do instead is just use the same machines that I always have scaled to kind of the max, and as the workloads naturally shift within them, the whole cluster still remains utilized. It's just something to think about. It may or may not map to your environment.
And on the greater than 100 nodes?
Okay, so greater than 100 nodes are, so VMSS supports greater than 100 nodes only when you use the large virtual scale sets. So as of today, I actually have written a common answer to that common question there.
You see.
So the answer is we do not support you for using same scale set for over 100. The reasons I've listed there, basically we cannot have a comparable FTs and UDs. So in order for you to go beyond a 100 node, I would recommend adding a new node type.
Yeah.
Okay, Service Manifest can support multiple service types, but will all be launched in the same host process. Can you explain a simple sample of why you do this? And we should probably talk about at the same time the new features that come in.
Yes, I mean, so that's a good question. There are scenarios we can think of where you might want to do that, but at the same time, we're actually moving away from the idea of sharing host processes, because
even for replicas of one service type.
Yeah, exactly. Even for replicas or instances of one service type, because it tends to lead to a lot of complexity. So the idea there with sharing a host process is that you have a potential upside in resource sharing and maybe a performance boost, but it is a more complicated model. So what we're moving towards now is separate processes for all replicas and for all instances of all services. Everyone has their own process. And that allows you to do things that you would normally do when you're writing a program, like, for example, look at performance counters for the process. So if you want to report memory usage, CPU, network usage, all these physical resource usages, usually those happen at the process level, and .NET doesn't really give you a way to view those kinds of properties for an individual object.
It's really hard to look at. It's really hard to look at memory consumption for 1,000 things in the CLR and know which one is consuming
exactly. Or the CPU usage of a single object in a process in C# is damn near impossible, right? You can't do it. And of course, the other thing too is with error handling and exception handling. Generally, the guidance in .NET at least is that if you do come across an exception that your program doesn't know how to handle, you let it bubble up and crash the process. But when you have a shared process with 100 replicas in it, that causes a lot of churn in the clusters. So it's not the wisest thing to do, even though the guidance is to do it. But if you have a single replica per process, then it becomes a little more acceptable to just go and crash the process.
Single replica per process is in the current release?
That'll actually be again around the build conference timeframe, mid-May. The release that comes out there will have this feature available. So back to the original question, when would you actually do multiple service types in a host process? So I'd have to go and think about a good scenario for that. I don't know if you have one off the top of your head.
There's old things that we've seen that communicate basically over shared interfaces or shared memory. In that case, the shared memory is automatic because you're already in the same process. We've seen things that previously used name pipes, stuff like that kind of have to be local together. There's also times where you know that you want service type 1 and service type 2 when they get created and they're in the same process. You know that if one fails, it's going to take the other one with it, which eliminates some sorts of race conditions and error handling. It's a niche thing. Most people don't really make use of it today. What we have seen people do is have multiple service types and multiple code packages, because what that means is that they're always going to be activated on the same node at around the same time. So you know that if XE1 is present, XE2 is also present, unless it also just failed. But that's another thing that we've seen people do. So you wouldn't have multiple service types within one XE. You'd have multiple service types in different XEs. There's a bunch of different types of things that that's useful for, but generally one-to-one is what we see. One service type, one XE, and one XE, one actual chunk of code.
Okay, so John asks, is there an article on how I can access the message headers for each request so I can add logging dispatcher to write audit logs? We currently do this on WCF services, and I'm looking to migrate those services to Service Fabric.
So if you're doing it with the WCF communication listeners in Service Fabric today, then most of that should just transfer because the channel clients and stuff that you have are the same.
Yes.
If you're looking to do it with something like service remoting, or
we actually for service remoting you can do the same. There's actually a sample up in our Getting Started samples repo that shows you how to add custom headers if you're using service remoting.
Yeah.
But I mean, kind of like what Matt was saying, right? It's you own the communication stack between your services. So however you do it in that communication stack, you do it the same way because you're in charge of it. The only one that we provide for you that we write is service remoting, and we do have an example of
I mean, it really does depend on if you're looking to hang on to WCF. If you are, then I would use the WCF communication listener within the services, and then most of what your client-side WCF stuff should just transfer directly over.
Right.
If you are interested or willing to change transports, then I have seen that WCF communication headers translate fairly naturally to HTTP headers or HTTP message parts that you can put the data in there and smuggle it that way, and then use that on the service side to hook everything up. But it depends a little bit on how exactly you want to move forward.
We see quite a few people migrating WCF over.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mark, I think we skipped a question from Nick here. It says, is there a method for moving away from default services if we're already using them in production?
Just hard.
That's hard. If you're stateful, that's tough.
Yeah, stateful in particular is hard. So for let's handle the hard case. For stateful ones, what you'd have to do is you'd have to basically quiesce the service. You'd have to stop taking writes, make sure everything stabilizes. Tell each partition of that stateful service to back itself up. Do a application type upgrade where you remove the default services. That'll cause Service Fabric to remove the default service from the cluster. Then you manually create, with the same service type, another service with exactly the same parameters that you created in the first place. So if you had 10 partitions, you create a new service with 10 partitions. then you cause a data loss event in each of those partitions where they go read their backup, restore it, and then you're back up and going. There's no good way that I can think of for stateful ones to do this without some sort of availability or downtime, where you have to kind of take some time where you stop the system and move the data around in order to get things up and running again. For stateless one, it's a little bit easier because depending upon how you route traffic, you might be able to just create the new stateless service on the fly, tell whatever your load balancer or gateway is to start routing to that one and be fine, and then delete the other one on the normally.
And this isn't limited to just default services. I mean,
anytime you need to change service.
Yeah, it's basically I have service A and I need to move everything over to service B. It's the same problem, and there's nothing built in today that allows you to do that without downtime.
Yeah.
Okay, we found multiple service instances, not only shared processes but app domain. How can we isolate them properly?
Oh yeah, there's only a single app domain that everything runs in.
Yeah, app domains are kind of going away anyway in the new .NET Core stuff, .NET Standard. So isolation that way, app domains were always a little leaky and they never quite provided full isolation anyway.
So I would look to single process per service instance
if you really care.
Yeah, and that'll be coming soon.
Okay, Marcin posted his link, which you can look up on the load reporting mechanism Matt mentioned for services, giving more resources to a hot service is also available for actors, ?
It's not directly available for actors, but what you can do is the actor model does allow you to write an actor service, which is kind of one layer down, which is more at the reliable services layer. So what you could do is you can inspect the state of the actors kind of that are running on top, and you say, oh, I've got 10,000 actors, so I'm reporting a load of 10,000 for my metric.
Yeah.
That's kind of how we'd recommend you integrate those two things.
Yeah, it is still a stateful service, so it's very similar. It's just a matter of how do you get information from each individual actor in a centralized place to be able to report it.
Yeah.
Okay, any cool new features in Visual Studio 2017?
Lots of cool new features.
Oh yeah.
You got live unit testing, you got some new exceptions, popping up exception messages directly in the code when you're doing debugging. So go ahead and check all of that out. Anything specifically related to Service Fabric? No, it's the same tooling set as you have in Visual Studio 2015, and it will continue to be so. A main thing to point out is the .NET Core support, which is now in Visual Studio 2017. It's actually, what is it? It's not preview. I don't know if it's G8 or RTM or whatever.
I was going to say it actually works.
It works.
It's real. It's real.
It's not specific to Service Fabric, but it's definitely relevant.
Yeah. So be aware that if you take your .NET Core services from Visual Studio 2015 to 2017, you do a one-way migration. You can't go back.
Welcome.
So, but it's better. It's definitely a lot better.
Yeah, remember how before, if you had a .NET Core project and Xproj, it was pretty much impossible to reference a non-.NET Core project before? That's all fixed. Like, that all just works now and it's beautiful.
And one thing I would, now that we are talking about Visual Studio, the 0.5 release of both the runtime and SDK and the tooling that will come out shortly, finally has this refresh mode that we've been talking about for a while. So basically, if you do web development, ASP.NET, we now support edit and refresh for CSHTML files and stuff like that. So you don't have to, while debugging, you can actually go and change your code and you can see it straight away in your services. You don't have to go and redeploy your services. And also doing stateless services, changing code there, the time it takes between building and actually seeing the result and having a debug up and running is highly improved. It's like a few seconds. So make sure that you go into a OneNode cluster local setup and put your Service Fabric project into what we call refresh mode. You will get these benefits.
Pretty cool.
Okay, this is a tricky question, Roberto. It says, in an on-prem scenario, how do you see the idea to implement a low I/O file service with actors? One file per actor. We did this and it works. We would like to force the memory unload of the actor state after read-write, but cannot. Alternatives. Can I use image store? And effectively, your goal is to share files between services without much 2IO reliably.
So I don't know that there's a good way to force the unload of the service or the unload of the actor unless you're actively.
You have to call the delete.
Yeah, you delete the whole actor object.
That's the only way you can do it.
Otherwise, you're bound by the garbage collection timer
Yeah.
and sending any messages to it. So if it hasn't been, if that actor object hasn't been touched in whatever the default collection period is, which is like what, 10 minutes, half an hour, something like that. 30 minutes. Then that actor object will be pulled out of memory and basically quiesced only to disk. If you did send a message to it, it would get reinstated. That's one way to do it. So you could take that that collection timer and turn it down to 5 minutes or something like that. But then if you have an actor that is getting activated every 6 minutes, then it's going to spend a lot of time writing itself to disk and then pulling itself back out.
Yes.
So
those are still on disk too.
So I think those are your two control options: the garbage
Yeah.
collection time and the deletion of actors.
Yeah.
I'm sorry if someone already asked this question. Is there any updates for .NET Core support? Yes, it's coming later this year.
Yeah, that'll be .NET Standard 2.0 is what we're targeting, and that's the third quarter of this year, so around fall.
Is there an article describing what we should do instead of default services? Yes, there is.
Yes, so there actually is. There's an article on service lifecycle that's in our docs that talks about the different ways to think about the events that happen and some different creation and deletion kind of patterns for dealing with services.
You can also look, we have a couple sample applications. The IoT sample that we have does dynamic application and service creation on the fly, and I think the health metrics sample now also
shows how you would go through it.
Yeah, service creation using commands rather than default.
Yeah, that one's not fully dynamic in the sense that the service isn't going to be creating and deleting more services on the fly.
Yeah.
But it does at least show the same commands that you would need.
There is
in
a
order
build
to...
script.
That does work stuff.
Yeah, so check those out. That's up on GitHub/Azure-samples. Just search for Service Fabric. That's up there.
Yep.
Okay, can I assume how that there will be new VSTS tasks for handling scenarios without default services, or should I start using PowerShell directly?
So we actually did publish silently a Service Fabric PowerShell task in VSTS. So it's a simple task that just hooks you up with your Service Fabric cluster during the authentication and connectivity, and then you can run any PowerShell command against the cluster within that task. So you can either provide a script that you have up in a repo, or you can just put in the commands directly in the task. So I think that would solve that scenario where you can then post the deployment. You could then go and create the services, service types and service instances you need.
Okay, other than mesh systems and Schneider Electric case studies, do you know of good examples using IoT scenarios using Service Fabric and actors?
I replied to it. I posted a link. There are a few more that we've added over the last few weeks.
Yeah, and there's the BMW case studies up there too.
Yes.
That's a good one to look at also.
And there's also, we should look at there's the IoT sample that we published, which is a good place to start as well. That doesn't use actors, so actors are useful in some of the IoT scenarios. We should also look at reliable services. Okay, I have an integer user ID. I can't read this anymore.
Yeah, generally hashing things, use FNV or city hash or something like that, and then basically map it to some other partition ID.
Yeah.
That way you're saved, even if you don't necessarily know what their values are or if they change them.
The guys for specific .NET functions suggested, I would suggest one not to use, which is the built-in get hash.
Do not use built-in get hash.
And you don't want to use that because that can change at any time out from under you in different versions of .NET, and that can cause all kinds of crazy problems. So just don't use that one, but there are plenty of other hash algorithms out there. We internally, for the actor ID hashing, we use CRC64.
Yep.
Lots of different options you can use.
Haishi created Service Fabric NuGet some months ago. I heard the direction is to evolve that. Are there any plans for the roadmap to share with us?
Nothing specific. His concept is still out there, and you can definitely use it. I think basically for now we're considering how that fit in with containers, and also bringing the Service Fabric runtime into containers at a point in time. So no specific roadmap.
Yeah, I would say we're focusing more on the container side of things at the moment as an image format that you can pull down and use.
Yeah, that might solve the same problems.
Yes, although the NuGet one is also a nice way to go, but it's not on the current moment. We're doing the container ones first. But yes, continue to look at Haishi's work.
But please use what he already created. You can definitely do that.
Will Azure clusters use the new managed disks feature in the future? Will Azure clusters use?
Yeah, I answered the question.
Okay.
So yes, we would actually replace our template with the managed disks. We're just testing it out, and that's why we have not flipped all of it to use managed disks.
Yeah, managed disks has only just come out in preview, hasn't it? Right now. So,
Marcin wants to know ability to invoke active runtime without using Service Fabric remoting. I don't think we have any plans to open that up at this point in time.
Not today.
OMS. OMS feels like partition ID and replica available for built-in events. Any way to get this with our own event sources? You might be able to look at the new monitoring and diagnostics article that we posted and use Eventflow. Eventflow would let you kind of publish that data to OMS as one sync, but to something else as a different sync, and give you some sort of ability to do some of the same things.
No, you can do it. So this, I mean, we have what's called a system event channel.
Yeah.
And the system event channel is where when we do operations like open, close, node up, node down, the ones you put here.
Yeah, but you can't really get them into your own event source, right?
Yeah.
That is what it's possible.
Yeah. So there is. I don't know if there's any API to pull these events out or listen to them.
Well, like I said, you can flow it into something
else. Do you
else.
really need it? I mean, that's the question. You could take the event source that is already there and you can pipe it into somewhere else using Eventflow. I guess that's the.
No, but I think the question is that you can take that system event stream and you can use Eventflow to push it into other sources.
Yes.
Like we've pushed that into App Insights.
Yes, but it will not be your own event source.
Correct.
So Roberta said, I need to terminate job execution before letting SF shut down my instance. The way we typically would let something shut down gracefully is if you're running inside of the run async code, then there's a cancellation token there. Just respond to that and handle it correctly. So you don't have to return immediately when that's signaled. You can watch for it to be signaled, do your cleanup, wait for things to complete, and then throw. That's typically how we do that. If you're just inside of a communication listener, then that's close async, and that's the same.
Okay, can you share anything about remoting v2 and what's happening there?
While I try to.
Oh, what was that? Keep going. We were on time.
Not at this time. The V2 release cycle is still under development. It should introduce some performance improvements and custom serialization, but I don't have a concrete date for release. It's still in the works right now.
Okay, I need to execute custom ASP.NET Web Forms legacy application. Yep. I would like to host them in the cluster. And MS Consultant told me to try Docker and IIS, and seems a good way. Is a roadmap for this. I guess container is a preview just for tooling or at the whole level.
Container stuff is still preview as a whole because there's a bunch of container features that are still being added.
Yeah, but I mean the container work is rapidly going towards GA as we look towards the build release. But on Windows,
the MS Consultant was right that is the recommended way for hosting IIS on certain clusters. So drop that into a container. Once that's GA, that'll be the way to do it.
So yes, very much so. Take the IIS workloads and host them inside there. We have.
Cannot hear you.
Well, we're out of time.
Well, okay.
Totally out of time.
Yes, Luke created a blog post on this, and I linked to his blog post from our article because it was such a good blog post, and you'll see a lot more on the container stuff as we launch the new features towards
May 15th. Yeah.
Yes.
Build.
May timeframe, yes. The 5.6 release, which will come out for build.
Comes together.
And I think there's the IoT sample, how to configure two service instances which share the same code package but different code package.
It would be same service.
Yeah.
You would use the same config package, but you would probably use config overrides.
You could use two config packages. I mean, you put another config package in there. It has a specific name, and you go ahead and reference it by that name to pull that other config package out. That way, you can version them independently and do some stuff like that.
Yeah. Sometimes that's good to do too. Different code, different config packages is actually a good idea. Sometimes if you have one config package which has all of your sensitive encrypted data, you have a separate config package. Yeah, it's easier to manage, and you have a separate config package which is kind of non-sensitive, just settings. That's one example where you might have different config packages. So it's not entirely unheard of.
Okay.
I think that's it. Looks like we got through them all. Thank you for joining us again.
Good questions.
Thank you, everybody.
Great questions. And as always, continue to post issues on our GitHub issues list.
Yep.
Continue to ask questions on Stack Overflow.
Yep.
or our MSDN forum.
Yep.
Although we tend just to prefer the Stack Overflow.
Stack Overflow.
Stack Overflow if you can.
Yes. Oh, you will post it just here. Yes,
Yep.
that's where it is. And
Yep.
thank you once again.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
See you at the next one, which will be
A month from now.
The third Thursday.
Third Thursday.
Third Thursday of each month.
Third Thursday. There you go.
Okay.
Yes, that's a tongue twister.
Right, thank you.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I think it's the 21st of April.
Bye. Stop presenting for the Delta.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks. We're still on. Sound still on
The calls.
We are.